Hey guys, tonight we slip into the rough, candlelit world of medieval marriages, where the idea of a fairy tale romance gets a swift kick into the muddy streets. Picture yourself in a drafty castle hall, the air thick with wood smoke and the chatter of a feast. A young bride, barely past childhood, stands rigid in a stiff gown, her future sealed by a contract she didn't write. You're surrounded by scheming nobles, stern priests, and parents haggling over dowries like it's a livestock market. Love. That's a luxury most can't afford, and honestly, you probably won't survive this era's version of happily ever after. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your city and local time. I'm curious where you're listening from tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the heart of a medieval village, the year somewhere around 1250, and the air buzzes with whispers of a wedding. But don't expect roses or heartfelt vows. The truth about medieval marriages is that they were less about romance and more about cold, hard strategy. You see a young couple at the church door, their faces blank, not because they're shy but because they've barely met. Marriages back then were deals, brokered to secure land, alliances, or just survival. The mainstream fact is stark. Most marriages were arranged, often by parents or lords, with the couple's feelings barely registering on the list of priorities. Historians note that in noble circles, marriages could shift the balance of power, tying rival families or even kingdoms together. But here's a quirky tidbit to make you raise an eyebrow. Some medieval betrothals were sealed with a bizarre ritual called hand fasting, where couples clasped hands through a hole in a stone, swearing vows in front of witnesses. Sounds quaint, right? Except the stone was often on a wind-swept hill, and you're freezing in your thin tunic while onlookers bet on whether you'll trip over the rock. Historians still argue whether hand fasting was legally binding or just a folksy prelude to a church-sanctioned union. Either way, it's a far cry from swiping right on a dating app. You wander through the village, past thatched roofs and pigs rooting in the dirt, noticing how marriage shaped everything. For nobles, it was about power. Think of Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose marriage to Henry II reshaped England's map. For peasants, it was about survival, pooling resources to outlast another brutal winter. You spot a merchant's daughter, her dowry of 2 goats and a cartload of grain being tallied by her father. Love might be a distant dream, but a good dowry could make or break a family's future. You can't help but smirk. Imagine proposing with a PowerPoint of your livestock assets. The church looms large, its shadow falling over every union. You hear the priest droning about sacred bonds, but it's less about spirituality and more about control. The Catholic Church, by the 13th century, had a chokehold on marriage, declaring it a sacrament to regulate who could wed and why. You're nudged by a villager who whispers that the priest might demand a fee for the ceremony. Talk about a divine paywall. And don't think you could just elope. Runaway marriages were scandalous and often voided. As you linger, you notice the crowd's excitement isn't for the couple's happiness but for the feast afterward. Ale flows, bread is torn, and someone's uncle is already drunk, singing off-key. You chuckle, thinking how some things never change. But beneath the merriment, there's a grim edge. This marriage, like most, is a transaction. The bride's eyes dart nervously. She's not dreaming of love but hoping her new husband isn't a tyrant. You feel the weight of her world, where romance is a storybook fantasy, and survival demands pragmatism. You step back, the village fading into the dusk, knowing this is just the start. These marriages, stripped of modern sentiment, were the glue of a society that valued land, lineage, and loyalty over love. And yet, as you'll see, some dared to defy the script, chasing flickers of affection in a world that rarely allowed it. You're trudging through a bustling medieval town, the cobblestones slick under your boots, as the clang of a blacksmith's hammer mixes with the shouts of market vendors. The air carries the scent of fresh bread and something less pleasant, maybe the open sewer nearby. You're here to unravel why love was rarely the spark that lit medieval marriages. Instead, these unions were kindled by necessity, ambition, and sometimes a lord's heavy hand. You pause by a tavern, where a crowd gossips about a recent betrothal, and you realize, arranged marriages weren't just common, they were the backbone of this world. The mainstream fact is clear. By the 12th century, arranged marriages dominated across Europe, from dusty peasant hovels to gilded noble halls. Parents, guardians, or feudal lords decided who you'd wed, often before you could even spell matrimony. For nobles, it was about stitching together power blocks. Think of the 1152 marriage of Louis VII of France to Constance of Castile, meant to secure a shaky alliance. For peasants, it was about survival, merging families to share labor and land. You overhear a farmer grumbling about his daughter's betrothal to a neighbor's son. It's not love driving the deal, but the promise of an extra field to plow. Here's a quirky tidbit to make you smirk. In some regions, betrothals could be sealed with a pledge gift, like a ring or a coin, but occasionally, it was weirder, like a lock of hair tied with a ribbon. Imagine handing over a sweaty strand of your hair, hoping it doesn't end up in a witch's brew. Historians still argue whether these gifts symbolized trust or just made it harder to back out without looking cheap. Either way, you're glad modern engagements stick to shiny rocks. You weave through the market, dodging a cart of turnips, and notice a young woman, maybe 16, being paraded by her mother to catch a suitor's eye. She's not blushing with romance but wincing under the weight of expectations. Arranged marriages often started with negotiations, not flirtations. You picture the parents haggling, 2 cows for her hand. Throw in a pig, and we've got a deal. It's less Romeo and Juliet, more like a medieval eBay auction. You can't help but chuckle. Imagine your dating profile listing, owns 3 chickens, negotiable. The process wasn't always cold, though. You spot a rare moment, a young man and woman stealing glances during a church service, their betrothal arranged but a shy spark flickering. Such moments were exceptions, not the rule. Most couples met at the altar, their first real conversation happening under the priest's watchful gaze. You feel a pang for them, knowing their lives are now tethered by a contract, not a crush. Feudal ties added another layer. If you were a knight or a vassal, your lord might decide your spouse to tighten his grip on the land. You overhear a knight muttering about his betrothal to a lord's niece, his voice dripping with resignation. It's not about love but loyalty, and maybe a nice chunk of farmland. You think back to that hand-fasting ritual from the village, remember that windswept hill. And it hits you. Even the quirky traditions were about binding people to promises, not passions. As you leave the town, the sun dipping low, you pass a wedding procession. The bride's face is unreadable, her groom stiff beside her. The crowd cheers, but you sense the weight of obligation beneath the noise. Love might sneak in later, like a guest who shows up late to the feast, but for now, this marriage is about duty. You wonder how many couples found warmth in these arranged bonds, and how many just endured them. You're standing in the dim glow of a medieval manor, the air heavy with the scent of damp wool and burning tallow candles. Outside, a cold wind rattles the shutters, but inside, a tense family gathering unfolds. You're here to witness the stark reality of child brides, a truth that makes your modern heart wince. The room buzzes with hushed voices, parents, aunts, and a stern-faced priest discussing a girl who looks barely old enough to braid her own hair. She's the bride-to-be, and you're about to see why youth was no barrier to medieval marriage. The mainstream fact hits hard. Girls as young as 12 were often married off in medieval Europe, especially among the nobility. Canon law, backed by the church, set 12 as the minimum age for girls to wed, though betrothals could happen even earlier. You watch the girl, her eyes fixed on the floor, as her father negotiates her dowry, a chest of silver and a promise of land. This wasn't rare. Historical records show figures like Margaret Beaufort, married at 12 to Edmund Tudor, bearing a child by 13. You shudder, thinking how you were probably still tripping over shoelaces at that age. Here's a quirky tidbit to lighten the mood. In some regions, child brides were gifted a doll or toy as part of the betrothal, a nod to their youth that feels more creepy than cute. Imagine a 10-year-old clutching a wooden doll while her future husband, twice her age, signs the contract. Historians still argue whether these early betrothals were consummated immediately or delayed until puberty, with some evidence suggesting families waited, but not always. The debate lingers, as records are spotty and motives murky. You step closer, catching the girl's nervous glance toward her mother, who offers no comfort, just a curt nod. These marriages weren't about her readiness but about sealing alliances or settling debts. You picture a noble family, their crest emblazoned on the wall, using this girl to link with a rival house. It's like a chess move, except the pawn is a person. You can't help but smirk. Imagine explaining to your friends that you're engaged because your dad needed a new trade route. The church's role looms large again. You hear the priest mutter about sacramental bonds, but it's clear he's here to enforce, not empathize. The church allowed these young marriages, arguing they were valid if the girl could speak her vows. But could she really understand them? You see her fidgeting, her small hands twisting the hem of her dress, and you wonder what she's thinking. Probably not about love, but maybe about escaping to play in the fields one last time. As you linger, you notice the groom, a man in his 20s, looking more bored than excited. He's not a monster, just a product of his time, bound by the same rules. Still, the age gap feels like a chasm. You think back to that hand-fasting ritual, remember that chilly hill, and realize even those quirky moments rarely involved kids this young. The system was relentless. Nobles needed heirs, peasants needed workers, and girls were the currency. You step outside, the cold biting your face, and see the girl's family preparing for the wedding feast. There's no joy in their hustle, just duty. You chuckle softly, imagining a modern wedding planner losing it over a 12-year-old's nuptials. But here, it's normal, and that's the gut punch. This girl's childhood is ending, swapped for a ring and a contract, and you're left wondering how she'll navigate the years ahead. You're weaving through a grand stone castle, its halls echoing with the clink of goblets and the murmur of plotting nobles. The air smells of roasted meat and wax from dripping chandeliers, but the mood is all business. You're here to dive into the high-stakes world of noble marriage politics, where weddings were less about hearts and more about empires. Picture yourself as a fly on the wall, watching lords and ladies trade promises like chess pieces, each move calculated to boost power or bury a feud. The mainstream fact is undeniable. Noble marriages in medieval Europe were diplomatic tools, often sealing alliances or ending wars. Take the 1199 marriage of Blanche of Castile to Louis VIII of France. It wasn't about love, but a treaty to ease tensions between England and France. You overhear a lord boasting about his daughter's betrothal to a rival son, securing a border fortress in the deal. It's like watching a medieval version of a corporate merger, except with more velvet and fewer spreadsheets. You smirk, imagining a noble pitching the match. Great dowry, plus she comes with a moat. Here's a quirky tidbit to make you grin. Some noble betrothals included proxy marriages, where stand-ins, sometimes random servants, said the vows if the groom was too busy warring or hunting. Imagine a stable boy muttering, "I do," while the real groom's off skewering enemies. Historians still argue whether these proxy ceremonies were fully binding or just placeholders until the couple met. The debate's murky, as some nobles later tried to wiggle out of them, claiming the servants' vows didn't count. You linger by a tapestry-covered wall, catching snippets of a heated negotiation. A duke's daughter is being offered to a foreign prince, her dowry including half a county and a herd of cattle. The bride, standing nearby, looks like she'd rather be anywhere else, her face pale under a heavy veil. You feel the weight of her role. She's not just a person but a bargaining chip, her marriage tying two feuding houses together. You think back to that young bride from the village, remember her nervous glances. And it hits you. Nobles or peasants, the game's the same, just with fancier props. The stakes are high. A bad marriage deal could spark a war, or a good one could double a lord's land. You watch a scribe scribbling the contract, detailing who gets what castle if the marriage sours. It's less romantic than a prenup and more like a military pact. You chuckle, picturing a modern couple signing over their Netflix password as part of the deal. The church, of course, is hovering, ensuring the union fits its rules, but even the priest seems more interested in the political fallout than the couple's feelings. As you move through the hall, you notice the bride's mother whispering fiercely to her husband, likely about securing a better title for their family. Everyone's playing the long game, except the bride and groom, who barely know each other. You wonder if they'll ever find common ground, or if they'll just grit their teeth through awkward feasts for the next few decades. The air grows heavy with ambition, and you realize these marriages weren't just personal. They shaped kingdoms, redrew maps, and decided who held the crown. You step out onto a balcony, the night air sharp and the stars piercing the sky. Below, servants hustle to prepare a lavish betrothal feast, but there's no warmth in the bustle. It's all strategy, every vow a step in a larger dance of power. You're left marveling at how these unions, cold as they seem, held entire realms together, or tore them apart. You're trudging through a muddy peasant village, the air thick with the smell of damp straw and cooking fires. Chickens cluck underfoot, and a distant cow lows as you pass ramshackle huts. You're here to uncover the truth about peasant marriages, where romance was as scarce as a full belly in winter. These weren't the grand alliances of nobles you saw in that castle, remember those scheming lords, but gritty, practical unions driven by the need to survive another season. The mainstream fact is straightforward. Peasant marriages in medieval Europe were about economics and labor, not love. Families paired off sons and daughters to merge resources, share workloads, or secure a scrap of land. You see a farmer shaking hands with his neighbor, sealing a betrothal between their children to combine their fields. Historical records, like manor court rolls, show these unions often hinged on practicalities. Two families doubling their oxen meant a better harvest. You smirk, imagining a modern first date where you compare tractor horsepower instead of hobbies. Here's a quirky tidbit to make you chuckle. In some villages, couples exchanged love tokens, like a carved spoon or a woven straw ring, not for romance but as a public sign they were off the market. Picture a guy handing over a lumpy spoon he whittled, hoping it says, commitment, and not, I'm bad at crafts. Historians still argue whether these tokens carried any emotional weight or were just cheap ways to seal a deal. The debate's tricky, as peasants left few written records of their feelings. You pause by a small cottage, where a young woman kneads dough while her mother lists her virtues to a suitor's family. She's strong, good with goats, and can churn butter like a champ, hardly the stuff of sonnets. The groom-to-be, a lanky lad with dirt-streaked hands, nods like he's inspecting livestock. You feel a twinge of sympathy. They're not dreaming of candlelit dinners but of surviving the next famine. Their marriage will mean shared labor, plowing, sowing, and praying the crops don't fail. The church still meddles, even here. You spot a priest lecturing the couple on marriage as a sacrament, but his words feel hollow when the bride's dowry is a single pig. Unlike noble weddings, there's no lavish feast, just a shared loaf and some watery ale. You think back to that hand-fasting ritual, remember the stone on the hill? And realize peasants sometimes skipped such fanfare, settling for a quick vow at the church door to save time for fieldwork. You laugh softly, imagine rushing your wedding to get back to weeding turnips. Life for peasants was relentless, and marriage was no escape. You watch the couple's parents haggle over who'll provide the cooking pot, their voices sharp. It's not about love, but about who'll carry the family through lean years. Widows and widowers often remarried fast, not for passion but to replace a lost worker. You overhear a villager whisper about a woman who married 3 times by 30, each husband buried after a harsh winter. It's grim, but you can't help but grin at the thought of her village nickname, probably husband hoarder. As you wander past the fields, the sun sinking low, you see the couple walking home, their shoulders slumped. They're not holding hands or whispering sweet nothings, they're already discussing who'll mend the fence tomorrow. This marriage is a partnership of survival, forged in necessity, not dreams. You're struck by how these quiet, practical unions kept villages alive, binding families in a world where every harvest was a gamble. You're standing in the shadow of a looming stone church, its bell tolling low and steady, vibrating through the mist-soaked morning. The scent of incense drifts out, mingling with the earthy tang of nearby fields. You're here to see how the church held an iron grip over medieval marriages, turning personal vows into a tightly controlled sacrament. Forget the village betrothals, remember that whittled spoon. Or noble alliances. This is where every union, high or low, bent to religious rule. The mainstream fact is crystal clear. By the 13th century, the Catholic Church had declared marriage a sacrament, giving it divine authority to dictate who could wed, when, and how. You watch a priest at the church door, his voice droning as he questions a nervous couple about their free consent. The church's rules were strict. Marriages had to be public, witnessed, and blessed to be valid. Historical records show the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 formalized these requirements, aiming to curb secret unions. You smirk, imagining a medieval elopement getting shut down by a priest with a rulebook. Here's a quirky tidbit to make you grin. In some parishes, couples had to pay a marriage fee to their lord or priest to marry, like a tax on tying the knot. Picture handing over a chicken just to say, "I do." Talk about a clucking nuisance. Historians still argue whether these fees were purely profit-driven or a way to control peasant mobility, as lords often used them to keep serfs tied to the land. The debate's murky, with few records showing how much couples grumbled about it. You step inside the church, the cold stone chilling your feet through thin shoes. The priest is lecturing the couple on forbidden degrees of kinship. Apparently, marrying your third cousin was a sin unless you got a pricey papal dispensation. You feel the couple's tension, one wrong answer, and their marriage could be voided. The church wasn't just about spirituality, it was a bureaucracy, enforcing rules that shaped society. You think back to that child bride, remember her fidgeting hands, and realize even her young vows were scrutinized under this sacred spotlight. The church's control went beyond the ceremony. You overhear a villager whisper about clandestine marriages, secret vows exchanged without witnesses, which the church despised. If caught, you'd face penance or worse, public shaming. You chuckle, picturing a couple sneaking behind a haystack to whisper vows, only to get ratted out by a nosy neighbor. The church insisted on public weddings to ensure transparency, but also to flex its authority. Even the timing was regulated. You couldn't marry during Lent or Advent, so good luck planning your spring fling. As you linger, you notice the priest recording the marriage in a ledger, his quill scratching like a judge's gavel. This wasn't just about love or even strategy, it was about order. The church saw marriage as a way to stabilize society, prevent sin, and keep everyone in line. You see the bride shift uncomfortably, her veil slipping, and wonder if she feels trapped by these divine rules. The groom, meanwhile, looks resigned, knowing his role is set by powers bigger than himself. You step back outside, the bell fading into the fog. The village hums with life, but the church's shadow touches every hut and hall. You realize its grip on marriage wasn't just about faith, it was about control, weaving every couple into a web of sacred and social obligation. You're left pondering how this shaped their lives, and what happened when someone dared to defy the priest's iron hand. You're lingering in a cramped medieval village square, the air buzzing with the chatter of onlookers and the creak of a cart hauling barrels of ale. The scent of fresh-baked bread mixes with a faint whiff of livestock, and you're here to grapple with the thorny question: did medieval brides really have a choice in their marriages, or was consent just a flimsy veil over coercion? You watch a young woman, her face half hidden by a linen headscarf, standing stiffly as her father negotiates with the suitor's family. The word consent floats around, but you're about to see how murky that concept was. The mainstream fact is clear. The church required free consent for a marriage to be valid, a rule cemented by the 12th century. Canon law insisted both bride and groom had to agree to the union, at least verbally, during the ceremony. You hear the priest at the church door ask the bride if she accepts the groom, and she mumbles a faint, yes. But her eyes dart to her father, and you sense the weight of his expectations. Historical records, like ecclesiastical court cases, show couples sometimes claimed they were forced, but proving coercion was tough. You smirk, imagining a medieval courtroom drama where the bride's defense is, "Dad glared at me." Here's a quirky tidbit to raise your eyebrow. In some regions, a bride could theoretically refuse a match by running away to a sanctuary church, where she'd be safe from forced vows, kind of like a medieval safe house. Picture her sprinting through fields, dodging angry relatives, only to find the priest charging room and board. Historians still argue whether this right to refuse was practical or just a legal loophole, as most women faced intense social pressure to comply. The debate's tricky, with few records of brides actually pulling it off. You step closer, catching the bride's clenched hands as her mother whispers something sharp in her ear. Consent might be the church's rule, but family pressure was the real law. You think back to that noble bride in the castle, remember her pale face under the veil, and realize even highborn women faced the same bind. For peasants, saying no could mean disinheritance or a beating. For nobles, it could spark a feud. You chuckle softly. Imagine telling your parents you're skipping the wedding because you're not feeling the vibe. The church's stance wasn't as noble as it sounded. You overhear a villager grumble that priests sometimes ignored obvious coercion if the families paid enough. The free consent rule was partly about preventing secret marriages, not protecting personal choice. You see the groom, his jaw tight, and realize he's not exactly free either. His lord pushed this match to secure a debt. Both are pawns in a game of land, labor, and loyalty. You feel a pang for them, trapped in a system where, yes, was often the only safe answer. As you wander through the square, you notice the crowd's mix of excitement and indifference. They're here for the ale and gossip, not to question the bride's feelings. You think back to that hand-fasting ritual, remember the chilly hill. And it hits you. Even those quirky traditions demanded public agreement, leaving little room for defiance. Some brides did resist. Records show rare cases of women dragging their heels or faking illness, but most caved under the crush of duty. You move toward the church, the ceremony wrapping up. The bride's consent seals the deal, but her silence afterward speaks louder. You wonder how many women found ways to carve out agency in these forced unions, or if they just learned to endure. The question of choice feels like a ghost, haunting every vow in this world where love was a luxury and obedience a necessity. You're standing in a bustling medieval churchyard, the air alive with the chatter of villagers and the clinking of mugs filled with warm ale. The scent of crushed herbs underfoot mixes with the smoky tang of roasting meat, and you're here to witness the wild, sometimes downright bizarre rituals of a medieval wedding day. Forget modern bouquets or choreographed first dances. These ceremonies were a mix of sacred vows and rowdy customs that could make you blush or laugh. You see the bride, her dress heavy with embroidery, stepping carefully toward the church door, and you're about to dive into a day unlike any wedding you've ever crashed. The mainstream fact is solid. Medieval weddings often took place at the church door, not inside, as part of a public ritual called the marriage in facie ecclesiae. By the 13th century, church rules demanded these open-air ceremonies to ensure transparency and witnesses, as seen in records from dioceses across Europe. You watch the couple exchange vows under the priest's stern gaze, the crowd pressing close to hear every word. It's less romantic and more like a public contract signing, with the whole village as notaries. You smirk, imagining a modern wedding live-streamed with a witnesses required hashtag. Here's a quirky tidbit to tickle you. In some regions, the bride's family might toss handfuls of grain or coins into the crowd after the vows, a tradition meant to bring fertility and wealth. Picture kids and old men scrambling in the dirt for a stray penny while the bride tries not to trip on her gown. Historians still argue whether this was purely symbolic or a sneaky way to bribe the crowd to stick around as witnesses. The debate's fuzzy, as written accounts rarely clarified the intent behind the chaos. You edge closer, noticing the bride's hands trembling as she hands over a simple ring, sometimes the only dowry a peasant could afford. The groom, looking equally nervous, ties a knotted cord around her waist, a custom signaling their bond. You think back to that peasant couple's practical union, remember the gifted spoon, and realize even their simple weddings had flair, just without the noble's budget. The crowd cheers, but it's more for the free ale waiting at the feast than for the couple's future bliss. The rituals don't stop at the vows. You follow the procession to a nearby hall, where the feast kicks off with raucous energy. Tables groan under platters of bread, stew, and questionable meat pies. Someone's cousin is already tipsy, shouting toasts that sound more like threats. You chuckle, picturing a medieval DJ hyping the crowd with a lute remix. But there's a serious edge. Every step, from the ring exchange to the feast, is choreographed to show the community this marriage is legit. The church, looming as always, insists on this public display to avoid disputes later. You notice odd customs sprinkled throughout. In some villages, the bride's shoes are stolen by rowdy guests, who demand a ransom, usually more ale, to return them. It's playful but also a reminder. Marriage was a community affair, not just a private bond. You think back to the consent debate, remember the bride's forced yes. And it hits you that these rituals often mask the lack of real choice. The bride smiles, but her eyes suggest she's just playing her part in this loud, chaotic script. As the sun dips, the crowd grows rowdier, and you sense the day's not over. The next ritual, whispered about with sly grins, is coming up, and it's one that'll make you wince. For now, you linger by the firelight, the laughter and clinking mugs filling the air, marveling at how these strange traditions bound people together in a world where love was rarely the guest of honor. You're huddled in the flickering glow of a medieval feast hall, the air thick with the aroma of spiced wine and sweaty revelers packed shoulder to shoulder. Laughter and shouts bounce off the rafters, but there's a nervous edge as the crowd's eyes dart toward the newlywed couple. You're about to witness the infamous bedding ceremony, a ritual so intrusive it makes your modern sensibilities squirm. Forget the joyful chaos of the wedding feast, remember the stolen shoes. This is where medieval marriages got uncomfortably public, and you're along for the awkward ride. The mainstream fact is jarring. Bedding ceremonies were common across medieval Europe, especially among nobles, to confirm a marriage's consummated and binding. Historical accounts, like those from 14th century noble weddings, describe crowds escorting the couple to bed, sometimes staying to watch or verify the act. You see the bride, her face a mask of dread, being led up a creaky staircase by giggling maids, while men shout crude jests. The groom trails behind, looking like he'd rather face a joust than this spectacle. You smirk, imagining posting this on social media with a caption like, "Worst wedding crash ever." Here's a quirky tidbit to ease the cringe. In some regions, the crowd threw socks or slippers at the couple's door for luck, a less invasive version of the ritual. Picture a bunch of tipsy villagers lobbing mismatched socks, hoping it magically ensures heirs. Historians still argue whether these ceremonies were about proving fertility or just an excuse for voyeuristic meddling. The debate's tricky, as records often focus on the ritual's presence, not its exact purpose, leaving room for speculation. You shuffle along with the crowd, your boots sticking to the rush-covered floor, as they herd the couple toward a curtained bedchamber. The bride's veil is tugged off, her hair spilling loose, a symbol of her new status, but also a cue for more raucous cheers. You feel a pang for her. This isn't a private milestone but a performance for a nosy audience. You think back to the church's iron grip, remember the priest's ledger. And it hits you. This ritual wasn't just tradition, it was proof, demanded by families and clergy to lock in alliances or inheritances. The atmosphere shifts from rowdy to almost ceremonial. Older women, acting as witnesses, fuss over the bride, while men clap the groom on the back with knowing grins. You hear whispers about ensuring the contract, and realize this is less about celebration and more about business. In noble circles, consummation was critical. Think of royal marriages where an unconsummated union could spark diplomatic chaos. You chuckle softly, imagining a medieval lawyer arguing, "No heirs, no deal." For peasants, the ritual was simpler but no less awkward. You overhear a villager mention their version, neighbors banging pots outside the couple's hut to encourage them. It's less formal but still invasive, like the whole village RSVP'd to your honeymoon. You think back to that peasant bride's practical vows, remember her goat dowry, and see how even their private moments were community property. The pressure's clear: produce children, secure the family's future, or face gossip and shame. As the curtains close around the couple's bed, the crowd lingers, some joking, others waiting for a signal from the witnesses. You feel the tension, the mix of festivity and obligation. The bride's mother stands nearby, her face unreadable, likely praying this seals the deal without drama. You wonder how the couple copes, their intimacy stolen by tradition and prying eyes. The noise fades as you slip toward the hall's edge, the firelight dimming, but the weight of this ritual lingers, a stark reminder that medieval marriages were public contracts, not private promises. You're sitting by a crackling hearth in a modest medieval home, the air warm with the scent of baked barley bread and faintly smoky from the fire. Outside, rain patters on the thatched roof, but inside, a newlywed couple moves awkwardly around each other, their marriage barely a week old. You're here to unravel the rigid roles and duties that defined medieval husbands and wives, a world where love took a back seat to obligation. Forget the raucous bedding ceremony, remember those flying socks. Now it's about the daily grind of living out those vows, and you're about to see how tightly scripted their lives were. The mainstream fact is clear: medieval marriage came with strict gender roles, rooted in church teachings and social custom. Men were expected to provide, protect, and govern the household, while women managed the home, bore children, and obeyed their husbands. You watch the wife, her hands busy spinning wool, as her husband returns from the fields, his boots caked with mud. Historical records, like sermons and legal codes, emphasize this division. Think of the 13th century text De Erudition Principum, urging wives to be submissive. You smirk, imagining a medieval self-help book titled, How to Be a Dutiful Spouse in 3 Easy Centuries. Here's a quirky tidbit to make you grin. In some villages, a wife's skill at brewing ale was so vital that a bad batch could land her in the village stocks, labeled a dishonest brewer. Picture her standing there, soggy and sheepish, while neighbors jeer over her watery ale. Historians still argue whether these punishments were about quality control or just another way to keep women in check. The debate's murky, as court records often mix practical and patriarchal motives. You lean closer, noticing the wife's quick glance at her husband as she sets out a simple meal of pottage and bread. Her role is relentless: cooking, cleaning, raising kids, and often helping in the fields or with livestock. You think back to that peasant bride's dowry, remember that lone pig, and realize her value was tied to labor, not love. The husband, meanwhile, is the head of the house, making decisions, like whether to sell a calf or pay the Lord's tax. But you see the strain in his face. His duty to provide isn't easy when crops fail or bandits raid. The church reinforces this hierarchy. You recall the priest's droning voice, remember his kinship rules, preaching that wives must submit, citing Bible verses like Ephesians 5 verse 22. Yet, you notice small acts of partnership, the wife quietly suggesting they save grain for winter, the husband nodding without fanfare. It's not equality, but it's practical teamwork, born of necessity. You chuckle, picturing a modern couple therapy session where the counselor says, "Just split the plowing duties, okay?" For nobles, the roles were fancier but no less rigid. You imagine a lady in a castle, overseeing servants and embroidery, while her lord husband negotiates wars or hunts. Her duty is to produce heirs and uphold the family's honor, his to expand their power. You think back to that noble bride's alliance, remember the border fortress, and see how her role as a wife was just an extension of that political deal. Even queens weren't exempt. Think of Eleanor of Aquitaine, juggling diplomacy while her husband, Henry II, called the shots. As you watch the couple settle by the fire, their silence heavy but not hostile, you sense the weight of their duties. Love might grow here, like a weed in cracked stone, but for now, their marriage is a machine, each playing their part to keep it running. You wonder how they navigate these roles when tempers flare or dreams creep in, and what happens when one steps out of line in a world so unforgiving of rebellion. You're skulking through the dim streets of a medieval town at dusk, the air sharp with the scent of wood smoke and the faint tang of spilled ale from a nearby tavern. Shadows flicker as you pass shuttered windows, where whispers of scandal hum like bees. You're here to uncover the harsh punishments for infidelity in medieval marriages, a world where straying from vows could cost you more than a broken heart. Forget the quiet domesticity of that peasant couple by the hearth, remember their unspoken teamwork. Now you're diving into the consequences when trust shattered and tongues wagged. The mainstream fact is grim. Adultery in medieval Europe was a serious offense, often punished by law, church, or community, with women facing harsher consequences than men. Legal codes, like the 13th century Saxonspiegel in Germany, allowed fines, public shaming, or even corporal punishment for unfaithful wives. You overhear a crowd gossiping about a woman caught with a merchant's apprentice. She's facing a humiliating parade through town, her head shaved. Men, meanwhile, often got off with a fine or a slap on the wrist, especially if they were noble. You smirk, imagining a medieval judge shrugging, "Boys will be boys, but pay up." Here's a quirky tidbit to make you chuckle. In some towns, adulterers were forced to wear shame masks, iron headgear shaped like animal faces, to mock them publicly. Picture a guy trudging through the market, his pig-shaped mask clanking, while kids pelt him with rotten cabbage. Historians still argue whether these punishments were meant to deter infidelity or just entertain the mob. The debate's cloudy, as court records focus more on the spectacle than the moral goal. You pause by the town square, where a wooden pillory stands, its hinges creaking in the wind. You imagine the woman there, her shaved head bared to jeers, and feel the sting of her shame. The church, ever present, branded adultery a sin, threatening excommunication or penance, like fasting for months or crawling to a shrine. You think back to the priest's iron grip, remember his marriage ledger, and realize infidelity wasn't just a personal betrayal but a defiance of sacred order. For nobles, it was even messier. Think of King Philip II of France, whose adulterous remarriage sparked a papal feud. The double standard burns. You hear a man boast in the tavern about his conquests, met with laughs, while a woman's whispered affair could end in banishment. You see a wife, her eyes downcast, hurrying past the gossipers, and wonder if she's hiding a secret or just dodging suspicion. Community policing was ruthless, neighbors snitched, and lords enforced morality to keep their lands orderly. You chuckle, picturing a medieval neighborhood watch group, armed with torches and wagging fingers. Punishments varied by class. Peasants faced local justice, fines or floggings, while nobles might lose titles or face political fallout. You think back to that noble bride's alliance, remember the fortress deal, and see how her infidelity could unravel a kingdom's peace. Some regions allowed husbands to correct unfaithful wives with violence, though courts frowned on excess. You wince, imagining a husband claiming, "I only hit her a little," as the judge nods. As you slip away from the square, the stars piercing the cold sky, you feel the weight of this unforgiving world. Infidelity wasn't just a mistake, it was a crime against family, faith, and power. You wonder how many couples, trapped in loveless unions, risked it all for a fleeting spark, and how many paid dearly for a moment of defiance. The town grows quiet, but the threat of punishment lingers, a shadow over every marriage bed. Word count, 10:40. Awaiting. Continue. You're pacing the chilly corridors of a medieval courthouse, the air damp with the scent of mildew and old parchment. Flickering torchlight dances on stone walls, and you hear the scratch of a scribe's quill as a tense family dispute unfolds. You're here to explore the tricky path of annulment, the rare and tangled way medieval marriages could legally end. Forget the scandal of infidelity, remember that pig-shaped shame mask. This is about unraveling vows through loopholes and legal battles, and you're about to see why breaking a marriage was harder than forging one. The mainstream fact is stark. Annulments in medieval Europe were granted by the church, not secular courts, and required proving the marriage was invalid from the start. Canon law allowed annulments for reasons like consanguinity, being too closely related, lack of consent, or impotence, as seen in cases like King Louis VII's annulment from Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152, citing distant kinship. You watch a nobleman argue before a bishop, claiming his wife was his fourth cousin, his evidence a shaky family tree. You smirk, imagining him digging through dusty scrolls like it's a medieval ancestry.com. Here's a quirky tidbit to make you grin. Some annulment pleas hinged on bizarre claims, like pre-contract, where one spouse swore they were secretly betrothed to someone else first. Picture a woman insisting she whispered vows to a shepherd boy years ago, hoping to dodge her current husband. Historians still argue whether these claims were genuine or just creative fibs to escape unhappy unions. The debate's messy, as church records often note the ruling but not the truth behind the story. You lean closer, catching the bishop's skeptical frown as the nobleman's wife glares daggers. Annulments weren't divorces. Divorce didn't exist under church law, so you had to prove the marriage never counted. This was no easy out. You needed witnesses, money, and a good lawyer. You think back to the consent question, remember the bride's forced yes, and realize lack of consent was a common plea, though proving coercion was tough when families pressured both sides. Peasants rarely sought annulments, too costly, but nobles used them to rewrite alliances or secure better matches. The process was brutal. You hear whispers of a woman claiming her husband's impotence, a humiliating charge requiring examinations by midwives or priests. You wince, picturing a poor guy facing a panel of nosy clerics debating his manhood. If successful, the marriage vanished legally, but kids from the union could be branded illegitimate, losing inheritance rights. You think back to that noble marriage's politics, remember the fortress deal, and see how an annulment could spark wars or topple dynasties. The church held all the cards. You noticed the bishop's scribbling notes, likely weighing the nobleman's bribe against canon law. Papal dispensations could sometimes fix issues like kinship, but only for a price. Think indulgences for inconvenient cousins. You chuckle, imagining a medieval Yelp review. 5 stars for the Pope, got my annulment, bank account cries. Peasants, stuck without cash or clout, had fewer options, often enduring bad marriages or fleeing, risking excommunication. As you slip out of the courthouse, the rain now a soft drizzle, you feel the weight of this legal maze. Annulments were a privilege for the powerful, a rare escape from a sacrament meant to bind forever. You wonder how many trapped spouses dreamed of freedom but faced only dead ends, their vows a lock with no key. The corridor fades, but the echo of that quill lingers, a reminder of how tightly the church guarded the exit from marriage. You're strolling through a bustling medieval market, the air rich with the scent of fresh herbs, sizzling meat, and the faint tang of tanned leather. Stalls overflow with goods, and you spot a woman in a fine wool cloak, her head held high, bartering sharply with a cloth merchant. She's a widow, and you're here to discover the unexpected freedom some medieval widows gained after their husbands' deaths. Forget the legal maze of annulments, remember that shaky family tree. This is about women stepping out of marriage's shadow into a surprising space of power, and you're about to see how they navigated it. The mainstream fact is striking. In medieval Europe, widows often gained legal and economic autonomy unavailable to married women or spinsters. Under common law in places like England, a widow could inherit a third of her husband's estate, called her dower, and manage it independently. You watch the widow haggle, her voice firm as she secures a bolt of linen, clearly no stranger to running her own affairs. Historical records show figures like Marjorie Kemp, a 15th century widow who ran businesses and traveled freely, defying norms. You smirk, imagining her handing out medieval business cards: widow, merchant, boss. Here's a quirky tidbit to make you chuckle. In some towns, widows could join guilds or take over their husband's trade, but they'd lose that right if they remarried. Talk about a freedom catch. 22. Picture a widow blacksmith, hammering away, dodging suitors to keep her forge. Historians still argue whether this autonomy was a deliberate empowerment or just a practical fix to keep households running. The debate's thorny, as laws varied widely, and some regions restricted widows' rights to curb their influence. You linger by the stall, noticing the widow's confident stride, a contrast to the nervous brides you've seen. Remember the child bride's fidgeting hands. Unlike married women, who needed husbands' permission for contracts, widows could own property, sue, or make wills. You see her hand over coins with authority, and it hits you. Widowhood, though born of loss, could be a rare ticket to independence. For nobles, it was even bigger. Think of Joan of Navarre, who, as a widow, ruled lands and negotiated treaties. But it wasn't all rosy. You overhear gossip about the widow's wealth drawing greedy suitors or meddling lords, eager to control her assets. Remarriage was a trap. A new husband could reclaim her property, and the church, remember its iron grip, often nudged widows to stay chaste or join convents. You chuckle, picturing a widow dodging proposals like a medieval rom-com heroine, muttering, "Not my land, you don't." Yet, some widows remarried strategically, using their status to broker better deals than their first arranged unions. The community's eyes are always on her. You notice villagers whispering. Some admire her savvy, others call her too bold. Widows walked a tightrope, too successful, and they risked accusations of witchcraft or immorality. Too weak, and they'd lose everything. You think back to that peasant wife's duties, remember her ale-brewing woes, and realize widowhood freed women from those roles but swapped them for new pressures. Still, many thrived, running farms, shops, or even acting as moneylenders. As you leave the market, the sun warm on your face, you see the widow heading home, her basket heavy with goods. Her freedom, hard-won and fragile, feels like a quiet rebellion against a world that bound women to husbands or fathers. You wonder how many widows seized this chance to rewrite their lives, and how their stories rippled through a society so rigid yet full of cracks for the bold to slip through. You're wandering through a quiet medieval village at twilight, the air soft with the scent of cooling earth and distant wood smoke. Candlelight flickers in hut windows, and you hear the faint hum of a lullaby as families settle in. You're here to search for the rare spark of love in medieval marriages, those fleeting moments when affection bloomed despite the cold pragmatism of arranged unions. Forget the widow's bold independence, remember her sharp bartering. Now you're chasing whispers of romance in a world that rarely made room for it, and you're curious if it ever took root. The mainstream fact is sobering. Love was not the foundation of most medieval marriages, but some couples developed affection over time, a phenomenon historians call conjugal love. Records like letters or wills, such as those from 15th century English merchants, occasionally reveal tenderness, husbands praising wives' loyalty or wives mourning lost partners. You see a peasant couple by their doorstep, the man brushing mud off his wife's cloak with a gentle hand. It's not a grand gesture, but in this world of duty, it feels like a quiet rebellion. You smirk, imagining them sneaking a kiss when the priest isn't looking. Here's a quirky tidbit to make you smile. In some regions, couples left love tokens in secret, like a pressed flower or a carved wooden heart, hidden from prying eyes. Picture a wife tucking a tiny oak leaf into her husband's satchel, hoping he'll find it during a long day's work. Historians still argue whether these tokens were common or rare exceptions, as they're scarcely mentioned in surviving records. The debate's hazy, since love's private nature left few traces in a society obsessed with public contracts. You linger near the couple, noticing their easy silence as they share a crust of bread. Arranged marriages, like the ones you've seen, remember the child bride's nervous glance. Often started cold, but shared struggles, harsh winters, sick children, or a good harvest, could forge bonds. You think back to that peasant pair's teamwork, remember their grain-saving plan, and realize love sometimes grew like a crop, slow and unsteady, rooted in survival. For nobles, it was rarer but not impossible. Think of Edward III and Philippa of Hainaut, whose long marriage reportedly held genuine warmth. The church, unsurprisingly, had opinions. You recall its rigid rules, remember the kinship lectures, preaching that love should follow marriage, not precede it. Sermons urged couples to find godly affection, but you sense the couple's quiet touch defies that script. They're not reciting Bible verses, they're just together. You chuckle, picturing a priest grumbling that hand-holding isn't in the sacrament handbook. Still, the church's grip made open romance risky. Too much passion could be labeled sinful or disruptive. You wander further, passing a young pair stealing a moment by a haystack, their laughter muffled. They're likely betrothed, not yet married, and you wonder if their spark will survive the altar's weight. Love faced obstacles. Duty, distance, or early death often snuffed it out. Yet, some stories endure, like the 14th century Patin letters, where Margaret Paston's words to her husband hint at deep care. You think back to the bedding ceremony's intrusion, remember the nosy crowd, and see how love, when it existed, was a private act of defiance against a public world. As you leave the village, the stars bright above, you feel a warmth for these rare moments. Love wasn't the goal of medieval marriages, but when it appeared, it was like finding a flower in a stone wall, unexpected, fragile, and all the more precious for it. You wonder how many couples found this spark, and whether it was enough to light their way through a life of obligation. You're lounging in the glow of a grand medieval hall, the air rich with the scent of polished oak and melted wax from ornate candelabras. Tapestries ripple in the draught, depicting knights and maidens in dramatic poses, and you hear a minstrel strum a lute, singing a forbidden passion. You're here to debunk the myth of courtly love, that romanticized tale of chivalrous knights wooing noble ladies with poetry and devotion. Forget the quiet spark of real affection, remember that peasant's gentle hand. This is about separating fact from the flowery fiction that's colored our view of medieval romance, and you're ready to peel back the curtain. The mainstream fact is clear. Courtly love, as popularized in 12th and 13th century literature like Lancelot by Chrétien de Troyes, was largely a literary invention, not a widespread practice. It described knights performing heroic deeds for unattainable ladies, often married, in a platonic yet passionate game of adoration. You watch a young squire recite a poem to a lady, his voice trembling, but her amused smile suggests she's humoring him, not swooning. Historical evidence shows little proof of knights risking all for love. Most were busy warring or climbing ranks. You smirk, imagining a knight demanding sonnets instead of, sharpening his sword. Here's a quirky tidbit to make you chuckle. Some courtly love poems were so over the top, they included love trials, where knights supposedly debated who loved more purely, judged by a lady's court. Picture a bunch of armored guys arguing like it's a medieval reality show. My heart aches harder. Historians still argue whether these courts of love were real social events or just poetic fantasies spun by troubadours. The debate's murky, as no solid records confirm knights actually played these games outside of parchment. You lean against a pillar, watching the lady dismiss the squire with a wave, her attention shifting to her husband's political chat nearby. Courtly love stories, like those of Guinevere and Lancelot, glamorized adultery and unattainable desire, but real life was less forgiving. You think back to the harsh punishments for infidelity, remember the shame mask, and realize such flirty games could end in scandal or worse. The church, predictably, scoffed at courtly love's ideals, calling them sinful distractions from godly marriage duties. The myth took root in elite circles. You hear the minstrel sing of a knight's suffering for his lady, and notice noblewomen giggling, enjoying the flattery but not taking it seriously. Scholars suggest courtly love was partly a way for women to wield soft power, directing knights' loyalty without risking their honor. You think back to that noble bride's alliance, remember the fortress deal, and see how courtly love was a fantasy escape from her strategic reality. For men, it was a chance to flex chivalry without upsetting the feudal order. You chuckle, picturing a knight writing bad poetry to avoid actual rebellion. The gap between myth and reality is stark. You wander past a group of knights, their talk all about land disputes, not lovesick quests. Courtly love's tale spread through songs and manuscripts, shaping how later generations, like the Renaissance, viewed the Middle Ages. But most marriages, peasant or noble, stayed practical, not poetic. You think back to that rare conjugal love, remember the oak leaf token, and realize real affection was quieter, messier, and far more grounded than the minstrel's lofty tunes. As you slip out into the cool night, the lute's melody fading, you feel the weight of this myth. Courtly love painted a rosy gloss over a world of duty and deals, but its sparkle was mostly ink, not truth. You wonder how these stories shaped medieval hearts, tempting them to dream of romance in a life that offered so little room for it. You're weaving through a crowded medieval marketplace, the air buzzing with the clink of coins and the shouts of vendors hawking wool, spices, and questionable fish. The scent of fresh hay mixes with a tang of sweat, and you spot a father counting out silver for his daughter's dowry, his face etched with worry. You're here to uncover the economic core of medieval marriages, where vows were less about love and more about money, land, and survival. Forget the dreamy myths of courtly love, remember that squire's shaky poem. This is the cold, hard business of tying the knot, and you're about to see how cash ruled the altar. The mainstream fact is undeniable. Medieval marriages were financial transactions, with dowries and bride prices shaping every union. Dowries, goods, money, or land brought by the bride, were standard across classes, as seen in records like 14th-century Italian merchant contracts detailing chests of gold or vineyards. You watch the father hand over his coins to a groom's family, securing his daughter's match but draining his savings. For nobles, dowries could include entire estates, while peasants might offer a cow or a few tools. You smirk, imagining a modern prenup listing one slightly moody goat. Here's a quirky tidbit to make you grin. In some regions, a groom paid a bride price to the bride's family, but if the marriage failed, he might demand a refund, like a medieval return policy. Picture a guy storming back, shouting, "She didn't come with the promised chickens." Historians still argue whether bride prices were about compensating families or just another way to commodify women. The debate's tricky, as records often focus on the payment, not the social meaning behind it. You linger by the market stall, noticing the bride nearby, her eyes fixed on the ground as her dowry's value is debated like a sack of grain. You think back to that peasant wife's labor, remember her ale-brewing woes, and realize her marriage's worth was measured in assets, not affection. Dowries were crucial. Too small, and you risked rejection. Too large, and your family ate dirt for years. Nobles faced the same game. Think of the 1469 marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella, where her dowry helped unite Spain but came with political strings. The church, as always, had a stake. You recall its rigid rules, remember the public vows. But here it blessed unions partly to regulate wealth flow. Priests often mediated dowry disputes, ensuring neither side got too greedy. You chuckle, picturing a priest moonlighting as a medieval accountant, muttering, "Thou shalt not shortchange the bride." But disputes were common. Families bickered over late payments or shoddy goods, dragging cases to church courts. You think back to the annulment battles, remember the impotence plea, and see how money fueled those fights too. For peasants, the economics were brutal. You overhear a villager whisper about a family selling land to fund a daughter's dowry, leaving them vulnerable to famine. Marriage wasn't just a union but a gamble, pooling resources to outlast hard times. Widows, like the one you saw, remember her market swagger, could leverage inherited dowers to remarry or stay independent, but most women had no such luck. You notice the groom's family inspecting a cart of linens, nodding like it's a used car deal. As you leave the market, the sun dipping low, you feel the weight of this system. Marriages were engines of wealth, moving land, labor, and power between families. You wonder how couples felt, their futures hinging on a ledger, and whether the rare spark of love, remember that oak leaf, could ever outweigh the heavy coins that bound them. The market's din fades, but the clink of silver echoes, a reminder that in this world, love was a luxury, and money was the vow that mattered. You're standing on a windswept hill overlooking a medieval landscape, the air crisp with the scent of wild thyme and distant wood smoke. Below, villages nestle among patchwork fields, and a castle's turrets pierce the horizon. You're here to reflect on the legacy of medieval marriages, how these pragmatic, often loveless unions shaped not just families but the world we know today. Forget the marketplace's clinking coins, remember that dowry deal. This is about tracing the long shadow of those vows, and you're ready to see how their echoes ripple through time. The mainstream fact is profound. Medieval marriages, built on strategy and survival, laid the foundations for modern social structures, from family dynamics to property laws. The emphasis on alliances and inheritance, seen in records like the Doomsday Book, shaped how wealth and power passed through generations, influencing today's legal systems. You gaze at the fields, imagining a peasant couple toiling there, their union ensuring their children's claim to that plot, a system still echoed in inheritance disputes today. You smirk, picturing a modern lawyer arguing over a medieval cow's equivalent in court. Here's a quirky tidbit to make you smile. Some medieval marriage customs, like exchanging rings or throwing grain, persist in modern weddings, stripped of their original economic weight. Picture tossing rice at a bride today, not knowing it once symbolized a dowry's fertility wish. Historians still argue whether these traditions survived by chance or because they carried universal human hopes, even in a world of arranged vows. The debate's open, as cultural evolution is hard to pin down across centuries. You wander down the hill, your boots brushing heather, and think back to the child brides, remember their trembling hands. The noble alliances, remember the fortress steel. And the rare sparks of love, remember that oak leaf. Each marriage, whether forged in a churchyard or a castle, was a thread in a vast tapestry of power, faith, and survival. The church's grip, remember the priest's ledger. Standardized marriage, creating a model that influenced Western family structures, from monogamy to legal consent. You chuckle, imagining a medieval priest rolling his eyes at today's reality TV weddings. The economic core of these unions, remember the bride price, left deep marks. You see the castle in the distance and recall how noble marriages redrew borders, like those of Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose unions shifted empires. Those deals birthed dynasties, some still symbolically ruling today. For peasants, marriages ensured labor and land stayed in families, a logic that shaped rural communities for centuries. You think back to the widow's freedom, remember her market swagger, and realize her autonomy foreshadowed modern women's property rights, hard-won through time. The myth of romance, like courtly love, remember the lute's tune, colored how we imagine the past, but the reality was grittier. You pause, feeling the breeze, and consider how medieval couples' resilience, navigating coercion, duty, and rare affection, set a template for enduring partnerships. Their world feels distant, yet every modern vow carries a faint echo of their practical, sacred bonds. You wonder how many of us, saying, "I do," unknowingly nod to their legacy. As the sun dips, painting the sky soft gold, your thoughts slow, the hills quiet wrapping around you like a blanket. Those medieval marriages, forged in necessity, wove the roots of families, laws, and nations. Their stories, of sacrifice, strategy, and fleeting love, linger in the fields below, whispering lessons of endurance. Let the wind carry their weight away now, easing your mind. Picture the stars emerging, each a tiny light from a world long past, guiding you to rest. Close your eyes, let the hum of history fade, and drift into dreams where love, perhaps, finds its own quiet path.